With the recent Wendigo creepypasta we had, for episode 6 of our campfire stories, and the short I did, I've felt inspired to research the Wendigo itself, leading to a bit of a deep dive that we'll be jumping into today. But first of all, we need to ask exactly what is a Wendigo. The Wendigo, also Wendigo, Widikov, Wedico, etc., is a malevolent spirit or monster prominent in the oral traditions of various Algonquian-speaking indigenous peoples of North America. The concept appears in Ojibwe, Cree, Innu, and other related cultures, with each nation having its own name and nuances for the creature. For example, the term derives from the Ojibwe word Wendigo and Cree Watikov, meaning a winter cannibal monster, and some scholars trace its Proto-Algonquian root to a word for owl. In all traditions, the Wendigo is closely associated with winter, starvation, and cannibalism, embodying the ever-present fear of hunger in the harsh northern woodlands. So, all that said, let's take a deeper look at the Wendigo. Across these cultures, the Wendigo's characteristics are consistently horrific. It is often described as gaunt to the point of emaciation, with gray, mummified skin pulled taut over its bones and glowing or sunken eyes. Its lips are said to be chewed or missing, having devoured them in its own hunger, and it reeks of decay. In many Ojibwe, Cree, Naskapi, and Innu stories, the Wendigo is an unnaturally tall giant, growing larger after each meal so that it can never be sated. No matter how much human flesh it consumes, it remains forever starving, a gluttonous and extremely thin husk driven by insatiable hunger. Some legends emphasize its supernatural speed, strength, and keen senses as a hunter of humans, perfectly adapted to stalk prey in the barren winter forests of Canada and the northern US. The Wendigo can also be portrayed as a malevolent possessing spirit, rather than a physical beast. It might invade human minds, turning people into cannibalistic killers during famines. In either form, all Wendigos were once human, whether transformed by dark magic or by their own heinous acts. They have become something monstrous, corrupted by evil and hunger. Symbolically, the Wendigo is a powerful personification of excess and moral breakdown. Indigenous interpretations often see it as the embodiment of three related concepts: winter, hunger, and selfishness. It represents the desperate conditions of winter famine and the horrific outcome of breaking the taboo of cannibalism in those dire times. By consuming human flesh, the Wendigo loses its humanity and is doomed to eternal appetite, a warning of the spiritual cost of unforgivable deeds. Thus, in Algonquian moral lore, the Wendigo functions as a cautionary tale. It instills the values of community over individual greed, reminding people that succumbing to selfish hunger or violence will turn one into a monster. For instance, Ojibwe and Cree elders taught that individuals overcome by greed or social discord could become Wendigos. So the story reinforced cooperation and moderation during hard times. To ward off this danger, some communities even performed a Wendigo dance, Wendigo Kanjimowin, during famines, a satirical ceremonial dance where dancers wore masks and mimicked the Wendigo to reinforce the seriousness of the cannibalism taboo and remind everyone of the monster that greed and desperation could create. In summary, while specific details vary among Algonquian peoples, the Wendigo is universally depicted as a horrific man-eating entity and a symbol of the peril of losing one's humanity through violence, greed, or gluttony. But why is it that the legend of the Wendigo has become so loved in modern horror? Well, it could be in no small part thanks to the wealth of actual historical accounts involving the Wendigo as a true being. But what do I mean by that? Well, I'll tell you. The Wendigo legend is not only mythic, but has also been invoked in real historical events, where individuals were accused or believed themselves to be Wendigos. Indigenous oral histories include accounts of people turned cannibal, and needing to be killed before they fully transformed into the monster. Early colonial records also document what we now call Wendigo phenomena. For example, in 1661, the Jesuit missionaries in New France reported encountering a bizarre ailment among certain Algonquians, individuals who became possessed by an unquenchable desire to eat human flesh. The Jesuit relations describe these people as so ravenous that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men, like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously, without being able to appease or satisfy their appetite, always seeking new prey. The report noted that the only remedy among the indigenous people for this affliction was to execute the sufferer, a grim indication of how seriously such incidents were taken. This 17th century account, while filtered through European perception, is often cited as an early written record of the Wendigo belief manifesting in real life, effectively a description of what later came to be known as Wendigo psychosis. Several well-known 19th century cases illustrate the intersection of the Wendigo myth with historical reality. One of the most infamous incidents involved a Cree man named Swift Runner, often highlighted as a true case of Wendigo behavior. In the brutal winter of 1878-79 in Alberta, Swift Runner and his family were starving after being cut off from supplies. Though they were camped only about 25 miles from a Hudson's Bay Company post with food, Swift Runner murdered and cannibalized his wife and 6 children over the winter. When his crimes came to light, Swift Runner claimed that he had been possessed by a Wendigo spirit that drove him to this atrocity. The authorities saw no evidence of mere survival cannibalism, since food was relatively nearby and he had devoured all his family members. Suggesting something more deranged at play, he ultimately confessed and was executed by Canadian authorities in 1879, the first legal hanging in Alberta's history. In hindsight, Swift Runner's case has been interpreted as a classic example of Wendigo psychosis, where a person seemingly becomes a Wendigo-like cannibal without true necessity. Another notorious case is that of Jack Fiddler, Jawuno Jijigo Gaubo, an Ojibwe chief and shaman. Jack Fiddler was famed in his community for being a Wendigo killer, someone who could recognize and dispatch those afflicted by the Wendigo spirit. Over his life, Fiddler claimed to have defeated at least 14 Wendigos, often by killing members of his own band who were in the throes of Wendigo transformation, or who begged for death before they harmed others. In 1907, news of Fiddler's most recent Wendigo execution, the killing of a woman said to be turning into a Wendigo, reached Canadian authorities. He and his brother Joseph were arrested and charged with murder by the Northwest Mounted Police, marking a collision between Indigenous customary law and Canadian law. Jack Fiddler died by suicide in custody before trial, and Joseph Fiddler was convicted of murder. Although he received a pardon, it came just a few days after he had already died in prison. The Jack Fiddler case demonstrates that, within Cree and Ojibwe legal traditions, killing a Wendigo was considered a form of protection, not murder, whereas the Canadian legal system did not recognize the Wendigo belief as justification. It also provided outsiders with first-hand documentation of Indigenous Wendigo beliefs. Hudson's Bay Company traders and missionaries had recorded multiple incidents of people exhibiting Wendigo-like cannibalism, and acknowledged that fear of Wendigos was very real in these communities. Moving into the 20th century, reports of Wendigo incidents waned. The frequency of alleged Wendigo cases decreased sharply in the 20th century, as Algonquian communities had greater exposure to Western lifestyles, Christianity, and stable food supplies, reducing the conditions that gave rise to Wendigo accusations. What might have been interpreted as Wendigo possession in earlier times began to be seen through the lens of mental illness or criminality by outside authorities. In modern clinical literature, Wendigo psychosis came to be listed as a rare culture-bound syndrome, essentially a historical phenomenon rather than an ongoing occurrence. By the late 1900s and early 2000s, there are virtually no documented contemporary cases of people truly believing themselves to be turning Wendigo. The Wendigo now looms more in memory and metaphor than in literal accusation. However, the legacy of these historical cases endures, illustrating how a terrifying legend can bleed into real human actions and legal systems. The Wendigo myth has fascinated scholars who seek to understand its connection to real-world behaviors and psychological conditions. In psychiatry and anthropology, the term Wendigo psychosis was coined to describe a purported mental disorder in which a person has an intense desire to consume human flesh and a fear of becoming a cannibal. Mid-20th century psychologists classified it as a culture-bound syndrome, an illness believed to exist only within a specific cultural context, in this case, among Algonquian peoples. Symptoms were said to include depression, homicidal or suicidal thoughts, and delusions of transforming into a Wendigo monster. Crucially, it was distinguished from ordinary starvation's cannibalism. Wendigo psychosis supposedly struck even when food was available, making the afflicted person's cannibalistic craving pathological rather than rational. For example, as noted earlier, swift runner's cannibalism occurred despite nearby supplies, which psychiatrists later cited as evidence of a psychological disorder rather than mere survival instinct. Early 20th century medical reports recorded a handful of such cases and debated their causes. Some observers, even in 1916, remarked that they had known a few instances of this deplorable turn of mind, emphasizing that hunger was not a valid excuse in those cases. This gave weight to the idea that Wendigo psychosis was a genuine, if extremely rare, psychological condition, triggered by cultural belief and individual trauma, wherein a person could enter a delusional state and act out the Wendigo role. However, later anthropological analysis has been skeptical of the literal existence of Wendigo psychosis as a distinct mental illness. In the 1980s, a heated debate arose over the historicity of this so-called disorder. Some researchers, such as anthropologist Lou Morano, argued that no clinical Wendigo psychosis cases have ever been directly observed by scientists, and that the idea was likely a construction, an artifact of research created by credulous outsiders taking legends at face value. James B. Waldron, a medical anthropologist, famously wrote in 2004 that no actual cases of Wendigo psychosis have ever been studied, and Morano's scathing critique in 1985 should have killed off the cannibal monster within the psychiatric annals. Waldron noted wryly that the Wendigo psychosis concept has taken on a life of its own in scholarly circles. The most perfect example of the construction of an aboriginal mental disorder by the scholarly professions. In other words, some academics suspect that early tales of Wendigo psychosis were exaggerated or even misunderstandings, perhaps cases of ordinary psychopathy or violence later rationalized under a folk belief. They point out that many so-called cases might have been simply hostile accusations in times of social stress, e.g., labeling someone a Wendigo to justify their ostracism or execution during famine. Indeed, the latest edition of the ICD, International Classification of Diseases, lists Wendigo as a culture-specific disorder, noted only in historical records, and acknowledges that its legitimacy has been questioned, with some experts suggesting incidents were just a form of social stigma or panic rather than a true illness. Thus, contemporary consensus leans toward viewing Wendigo psychosis as a historical cultural phenomenon, a remarkable intersection of belief and behavior, rather than a medically recognized diagnosis one might encounter today. Anthropologists and historians, meanwhile, are deeply interested in what the Wendigo mythos reveals about indigenous culture and colonial impacts. Many see the Wendigo legend as a reflection of the extreme environment and social values of the Algonquian peoples. Scholar Emily Zarka observes that virtually all cultures with Wendigo stories lived in northern boreal regions with harsh winters and the constant threat of famine. So, they developed the Wendigo as the incarnation of winter, the embodiment of hunger, and the personification of selfishness. In this view, the legend served a practical social function. It warned community members about the dangers of insatiable greed and cannibalistic desperation, thereby reinforcing community solidarity and ethical norms. Anthropologist Robin Riddington and others have noted that among subarctic First Nations, sharing food and resources was crucial for survival, so a figure that embodies the opposite, a lone individual who literally consumes his kin, is the ultimate cautionary figure, essentially antisocial behavior incarnate. The Wendigo was also used to explain unusual atrocities. In small, tight-knit communities, an incident of cannibalism or violent insanity would be so shocking that framing it as a spirit possession provided an explanation and a warning for the future. In this way, the Wendigo belief helped communities handle the unthinkable by assigning it to the realm of the supernatural. Importantly, Indigenous scholars have also interpreted the Wendigo in a broader metaphorical sense, especially in the context of historical trauma and colonialism. Rather than just a literal monster, the Wendigo concept can signify any force that engenders greed, social discord, and destruction. Ojibwe scholar Brady DeSanti writes that a Wendigo can be understood as a person, or even an ideology that is fundamentally imbalanced and harmful to the community, driven by selfish consumption. Following this idea, some native and non-native thinkers have applied Wendigo to colonial exploiters and capitalists. Professor Chris Shedler explains that the Wendigo's endless appetite represents consuming forms of exclusion and assimilation, essentially comparing colonialism to a Wendigo that devours peoples and resources. Indeed, many Native American commentators describe the colonial process as a Wendigo. It violently displaced indigenous peoples from their lands and attempted to consume, assimilate, or destroy their cultures. Historian Jack D. Forbes famously coined the term Wetiko disease to describe the mindset of exploitation and greed that fueled European conquest of the Americas, explicitly drawing on the Wendigo metaphor of cannibalistic greed. Even in a modern environmental context, Wendigo has been evoked as a metaphor for corporations or individuals who recklessly destroy nature out of insatiable appetite. Thus, in anthropological and indigenous analyses, the Wendigo remains a potent symbol, not just a spooky tale, but a lens through which to view moral failure, social collapse, and the impact of colonial history on Native communities. It embodies the warning that if humans succumb to violence, greed, and disrespect for life, the Wendigo is always waiting, within or without. So, we've looked at the history and some of the sciences, but what about what's really helped spread the legend of the Wendigo far and wide? That's right, media and pop culture. Over the last century, the Wendigo has migrated from indigenous oral tradition to wider popular culture, often with significant alterations. One of the first major appearances of a Wendigo in Western literature was Algernon Blackwood's 1910 novella, The Wendigo. Blackwood's story, set in the Canadian wilderness, introduced the creature to horror readers outside indigenous communities. However, as scholar Joe Nazare notes, Blackwood's portrayal transformed the legend. His language carried undertones of the Indian savage trope, subtly recasting the Wendigo to fit colonial stereotypes. Despite, or because of this, Blackwood's tale became influential, establishing many tropes for later fictional Wendigos. It inspired other horror writers like August Derleth, who, in the 1930s, created the Wendigo-inspired entity Ithaqua in the Cthulhu mythos, and it ultimately informed Stephen King's depiction in Pet Sematary, 1983. In Pet Sematary, King's Wendigo is an outright demon of the woods, a personification of evil with gross physical features, ram's horns in place of ears, glowing eyes, a decaying yellow tongue that mark it as a ghoul rather than a nuanced metaphor. King used the Wendigo legend as the dark force behind a cursed Micmac burial ground, firmly entrenching the creature in the horror lexicon. By the mid-20th century, the Wendigo had thus become a recurring figure in horror fiction, often portrayed as a flesh-eating forest demon or an accursed monster. Even literary authors toyed with the concept. For instance, Thomas Pynchon in 1959 wrote a short story about a character developing Wendigo syndrome and going on a killing spree. In comics, Marvel introduced the Wendigo in 1973 as a hulking white-furred monster cursed upon anyone who commits cannibalism in the Canadian wilds. Marvel's Wendigo, more akin to a savage Bigfoot-like creature, is only loosely connected to the original lore beyond the cannibalism aspect. Each of these interpretations took the core idea of the Wendigo, but refashioned it for new audiences, usually emphasizing gore and monstrosity over cultural context. In film and television, Wendigos, or creatures inspired by them, have appeared numerous times, especially in horror and supernatural genres. Ravenous, 1999, is a cult classic that explicitly bases its plot on the Wendigo legend. Set in 19th century America, the film equates cannibalism with a supernatural Wendigo curse and uses it as an allegory for manifest destiny's consumption of lives and land. More recently, Antlers, 2021, produced by Guillermo del Toro, features a Wendigo as the primary monster, depicted as a towering deer-like beast with an elk skull head and a glowing heart, which passes from host to host with unrelenting hunger. This antlered design, also seen in shows like Hannibal, where a stag-headed Wendigo figure haunts the protagonist, reflects a modern pop culture aesthetic that has melded the Wendigo with forest spirit imagery. It's important to note that the antlered, deer skull Wendigo is not part of original Algonquian lore, but rather a creative invention that has now become a common visual shorthand for the creature in media. The Wendigo has also surfaced on television. For example, an early episode of Supernatural, 2005, featured a Wendigo as a human-eating monster in the woods, and the creature has appeared in animated series, tabletop games, and literature ranging from urban fantasy novels to suspense thrillers. Video games have embraced it too. The horror game Until Dawn, 2015, bases its entire plot twist on Wendigos, portraying them in a manner more consistent with legend, emaciated former humans turned cannibal mutants, and even referencing Native American lore as backstory. While these fictional portrayals have made the Wendigo internationally known, they often take liberties, sometimes to the point of overshadowing the original indigenous context. Many depictions reduce the Wendigo to a generic horror monster, a scary cannibal ghost or forest demon, without conveying the rich cultural warnings and ethics behind the legend. This trend has drawn criticism from indigenous voices and scholars. They argue that using the Wendigo as just another movie monster can amount to cultural appropriation, especially when creators are not native. As scholar Francesca A. Johnson observes, the Wendigo has become a convenient trope in horror, an indigenous monster that largely white protagonists can defeat, which misappropriates, discards, and demonizes the indigenous culture the myth comes from. In popular media, the Wendigo is frequently depicted as pure evil incarnate, a threat to be eliminated, which can implicitly cast indigenous beliefs as primitive or nefarious. This stands in contrast to the creature's role in the source cultures, where its story served a didactic purpose and was interwoven with community values. Nevertheless, not all modern uses are shallow. Some indigenous authors and filmmakers have reclaimed the Wendigo in creative ways, using it to explore contemporary issues. For instance, Chickasaw writer Linda Hogan's novel Solar Storms, 1995, invokes Wendigo stories as a metaphor to critique corporate exploitation and environmental destruction. Similarly, Ojibwe writer Nathan Adler's horror novel, Wrist, 2016, blends the traditional Wendigo legend with modern horror sensibilities. These works demonstrate that the Wendigo remains a vital, evolving symbol. In sum, the Wendigo's journey through media has been one of both misrepresentation and transformation. It has thrilled and terrified global audiences in novels, comics, movies, and games. But thoughtful engagement with its origins reminds us that behind the fiction is a profound indigenous warning about humanity, morality, and the hungry darkness that lives inside us all.